Hello everybody, I'm Endymion for the Dork at Arms, etc. And today we have a kind of special, kind of long, kind of weird video at the request of my one of my instructors and some folks in a seminar. I'm going to be reciting, doing a recording of me reciting this research essay that I did for a religious studies seminar. But just to warn you, I'm going to be making intermittent pauses to replenish my water, to stay hydrated and all that. And I may slip into voices to keep it interesting. And yeah, let's get started. Walpurga, the religious implications of the sainted arms upon martial ethic. Death comes for us all. This simple fact hangs distinctly over one's head like the sword of Damocles, especially in actual moments of mortal peril. Of course, the end of life is as timeless as the keeping of life, as exemplified by the manuscript known as the Walpurga Effect Book, or MS.I33. This text is inherently deeply spiritual, not in spite of its pragmatic focus. Where am I? I'm reading it right now. Pragmatic focus on fencing technique, but because of it. The martial ethic employed in this text is centered on the direct intervention of God, justice supplied post ad hoc as a result of judicial combat's uncertainty and implicit Catholic nature culture. Bracket. If you don't understand those terms, don't worry, I'll sort of explain them and throw that in. I don't quite explain them in my actual writ, but I'm going to explain them for everybody to understand who isn't in our very niche seminar of 15, 16 people. End bracket. With the case of the Walpurga Effect Book, also known as MS.I33, the martial ethic is complicated by the inclusion of Walpurga herself as a gendered lens through which to examine the religiously infused martial ethic of the treatise. The hats represent paragraph changes. To start, this manuscript is the oldest known surviving entry into the genre of ancient literature known as Fechtbücher, literally meaning fight books, which I define here as texts describing the theory and practice of self-defense. In the German tradition from which this term originates, these texts often include a certain poetic listing of techniques or brief discussions of underlying theory. These verses are called Zettel. And MS.I33 opens with a zettel of unusually sparse technical knowledge. I'm not going to do the Latin. The devil of hell does not dare do... Oh, that doesn't taste good. Do what the wanton monk dares, nor the old woman full of cunning. The explicit religiosity of this zettel sets it apart from others in the martial... other entries into the martial corpus. I should have corrected that. Oh, that's a typo. Yet it sets the precedent for the rest of this particular effect book, as one steeped from start to finish in theological nuance. The Zettel establishes, by way of explicit warning, what B. A. Tlesty calls the evident martial ethic. Our first term! Excellent! Also a note about the translation. I sort of combine Forgang's translation from the MS.I33 facsimile you can get from the Royal Armories at Leeds. Actually, let me grab my copy real quick. Hold on, let me pause. Movie magic! MS.I33, and I'm also combining it with the translation as given by one, I believe, Catherine Hager? I didn't format my citations correctly in this either. Oh, God! Oh well. What can they do? Expel me? Yes. The Tlesty martial ethic. This phrase describes a specific set of norms within a community regarding who is permitted to enact violence and what motivations are considered permissible causes for violence. In this case, the distich, distich means like a couplet that's taken from the classical tradition, so like Greek or Latin, and it's supposed to be like an elegy, which is a funeral poem. So the fact that this is already comparable with a classical funerary couplet is like, dude, even though it's attributed to Pope Pius II, I think it's like, it's already, like, that is so incredibly fun, and just that in and of itself, this Zettel could earn its own essay. 10 out of 10 would Zettel again. I'm away from the microphone, I gotta change that. In this case, the distich serves as a Zettel via instructing the reader to not enter hastily into the fight. It is well established that the manuscript was written by clerics in modern-day German territories, possibly over multiple years or even by multiple hands. For the sake of the reader's ease, I will be writing an agreement with Rachel E. Kellett that the treatise was composed for the purposes of instruction in German judicial duels. Because let's get real, if we talk about the purpose of this text, it's not nearly as fun as actually analyzing the techniques or the social context of the text itself, and judicial duels allows for the most nuanced take, so that's why I went for this interpretation. Again, that little aside is not in the writ. To this end, the lens of Tlesti's martial ethic is incredibly enlightening. If the text is employed to instruct duelists to fence more effectively, then the martial ethic is one of hierarchical lethal exchanges. That one should threaten my life leads me to consider their life forfeit, so I must remediate my foe's aggression and answer in kind, dealing a mortal blow to them, and in doing so proclaim my life to be worth more than their life. The exchange values in death dealing hinges on, in this schema, post-ad hoc circumstances. The first party is victorious, therefore they had the moral high ground, regardless of who incited the engagement to begin with. Although, as an additional aside, I learned after writing this that if you as the accuser didn't make an earnest attack to open the judicial duel, it might not be considered, like, valid, necessarily. Like, you might even be considered, unmanly or whatever, or unjust. You also had to defend yourself as the accused from that earnest attack, and defend yourself in earnest. So it was a give and take there. Sorry, I just got back from fencing, so my fencing shoes are still on. However, this exchange rate between mortal blows does partially rely on causality. One combatant must choose to be the aggressor, acting before the foe, and in choosing to engage in armed combat, that person has initiated a grave moral ambiguity along with a mortal ambiguity. See what I did there? The obscurity, who will be victorious and thus be revealed to be righteous in the eyes of God, runs in tandem with the innate tension that if thou shalt not kill is held as a direct commandment. How could one kill in a righteous fashion? Fundamentally, this comes down to the idea that nothing happens without the intentions of the divine. So no death that does occur could occur without the implicit green light from the Almighty. The judicial duel as a means of death dealing opens MS.I33 to rich textual analysis, which will be explored later. But first, I would like to discuss the figure of Walpurga herself as a symbol rather than an indexical icon from history. Quick thing, icon, index, symbol. An icon is a sign that is morphologically, like, direct to what it's representing. So if I draw a line to draw a straight road, that's an icon. An index is like tangential. It points to, it's indirectly physically adjacent to whatever it represents. So like smoke is indexical to fire, a weather vane is indexical to wind, and then symbol is just incredibly abstract. There's no physicality. That's Persian semiotics for ya. It has been rarely postulated that Walpurga may be a symbol, a representation of the saint. And this opens a portion of the discussion to go beyond the social history, complex and worthwhile though the subject is. Oh man, we're not even halfway in. The historical figure of Walpurga, according to Pamela Berger, was subject to reinfusion from the Catholic canon into the popular Germanic figure we now know today via folklore regarding like a gourd, regarding a pre-Christian agricultural goddess. I like pumpkins, they're gourdy. Such matrons of sowing held power in these folk traditions to dispel evil in order to ensure good harvests, and thus the spiritual and biotic sustenance of the community. Within this pre-modern schema, nature was perceived as a creation and the extension of God, who was also the giver of tongues, mankind's supremacy over the earth, and maker of all that one could see. So in other words, a maker of both nature and civilization. And we're getting now into nature culture. The congruence between the wilds and civilization is seen both through Walpurga and the aforementioned theologically imbued martial ethic, if one considers that a martial ethic is also tied to personal nature culture. And that's our first voodoo word, as my stepdad would put it. Or our second. Third. Effect book. Yeah. How to justify the breaking of the natural order through murder in this case is to claim self-defense and Deus vult. Deus vult is Latin for God wills it. Nature culture means how does a society invent a dichotomy in which nature and culture are separate, and how does it mediate or justify that? Yada, yada, yada. Walpurga's inclusion in this text, above the more obvious saints to select for invocation and effect book, such as Saint Mark. Anyone familiar with longsword will know the Marksbruder, or Brotherhood of Saint Mark, very popular, invokes her pre-Christian mode as a living apotrope. God, that's another voodoo word. Apotrope being like a protective amulet. In human form, an apotrope in human form. It is no coincidence that the defensible dispositions of sword and buckler are referred to as wards, for how they deviate the aggression of a foe, much like a saint's intervention to banish baleful devilry. I like that phrase. Banish baleful devilry. Huzzah! Walpurga's inclusion essentially brings her into the shield maiden role, remediating her protective temperament into a martial, masculine activity. Moreover, in being depicted as a figure standing... Where's my mouse? Standing for the text's martial ethic and nature culture, Walpurga shows the reader the sanctity of the techniques she's used. The techniques she utilizes. Fencing, in other words, is enacted as a fundamentally religious act. Fencing defends the self, defending life, and therefore preserves the natural order's inclination against unnatural death-dealing. So this is what Freud would refer to as the thanatos, or death motivator, in which Walpurga staves off lethal blows with the implements on hand in order to lifelong... No, I wanted to say live long. Shoot, that's another typo. Crap. Live long enough for her lifespan to run its course, which makes sense given the historical epitaph of the 8th century was never martyred. I'm getting more and more stressed the more I read this. I should have given myself more time to actually edit. Of course, there are also no records of Walpurga ever taking up arms, but her namesake is invoked with a sword and buckler, and I wish I had my sword and buckler with me, which are arguably symbols in each their own right. The buckler serves as an explicit reflection of her protective powers, and the sword is a plainly sharp cross. These images of Walpurga reflect a common contrast the fencers drew to themselves and animals within their nature culture regime, that humans lack teeth and claws with which they should defend themselves, yet animals are not armed with higher mental faculties. Armadillos aren't giving you culinary advice. Walpurga as a sewer and saint at arms then represents a mastery over her mind, expanded by rational learning in the way of prayer and self-defense, as well as her body, the supposedly frail female form now made destructive. Just as the saint was an extension of the old goddess, the sword and buckler act as extensions of the human body, made in the image and likeness of a... Nope, I skipped ahead. Extensions of the human body, and so too is the inherent divinity in beings that are made, according to the prevailing theology, made in the image and likeness of the Creator. So sword and buckler are extensions of your thanatos, your nature culture, your martial ethic, as it were. Saints are extensions of God, but you are also an extension of God because you are made in the image and likeness. By the way, that's what that means. Just as the saint intercedes on the behalf of the faithful, so too do the armaments intervene between the wielder and the aggressor. It's me trying to sound deep. Even in merely including her name as the only intentional point of reference to an explicit religious superstructure, the name carries all these implications and more. I'm going to go like this. Just cuz. All the implications and more, and regardless of whether those were ever voiced by the clerics who used the text. Invoking the name of a locally popular saint could only aid the overall cause behind writing the fact book, to pass on knowledge of self-defense, because it is legitimized and reinforced in the sanctity of Walpurga's presence. The aforementioned contradiction of justifying a heinous sin that goes against the natural, read, divine and legal order, is remediated by a figure who is introduced to breach yet another facet of the natural order, that being gender roles. I would argue that this example of Walpurga does not irredeemably violate her womanhood. She is fundamentally still enacting her saintly role as a protectress, and thus is not abandoning what would at the time be considered her womanly duty or habit. Even in the duel, Walpurga performs the righteous necessity of manifesting the divine in seeking the ritual combat that allows justice to be realized. The matter of the judicial duel... Can you tell that I've never taken a public speaking class? The matter of the judicial duel... I'm also slouching forward quite a bit. The matter of the judicial duel brings us to the more popular and perhaps more nuanced analysis of Walpurga's presence in the fact book. That being an iconic index of a real woman with this saintly name who studied to fence in a judicial duel. So going back to the whole icon index symbol is abstract, sword buckler protection, but there's no physical tie between them necessarily. They're not like... Yeah. But icon, it's a drawing of a woman, so there's a morphological directness. Index, it's still 2D and also stills rather than in motion. It's also reduced on the page, yada yada. To that end, I have mentioned judicial duels several times at this point without fully explaining what exactly a judicial duel was. The ritual combat was available to people of all classes, including clerics and, in some rare cases, women, in order to seek retribution for slights against personal honor or disputes over property via church and state-authorized violence. So now we're seeing where the power of the martial ethic really lies in that sense. As previously mentioned, this was performed within a theology that emphasized that nothing could happen outside of the divine order. So if a participant died, it would be explained that they were the guilty party in this dispute, hence why I called it a post-ad hoc kind of thing. Their foe, as the victor, would be acting as an implicit executioner by divine employment. Executioner by divine appointment. They're not getting paid for this. The victory would be an omen for their innocence, or else they would not have been allowed to enact this ultimate retribution, according to the logic of this ritual combat. The matter was finished. The survivor could reintegrate into the society at large. And I'm missing a space in between the next two words. Oh God, not another one. Continue. God himself was indexically present in the ordeal, as a sort of reverse exorcism to bring a concrete act of divinity into the public view. One could simultaneously argue that this ritual served as a controlled outlet, a mode through which social institutions could sculpt local bouts of peace-threatening frustration, thereby projecting structure for an otherwise dangerous fracture in the social order. Because you don't want everybody just killing each other willy-nilly, you know? Because you gotta channel that into specific fights. Before the duel itself... Now I'm just showing off. Before the violent ordeal itself, however, participants had to begin a period of training. This is when we get the dramatic music. A period of training called Le Tag. If it was deemed appropriate as a measure to remedy... What? If it was deemed appropriate as a measure to remedy what was usually a violation of property rights... There we go. Mostly property rights at this time, not honor. Then the parties involved would be given a period of time determined by the clerical and/or governmental authority in which to prepare for the fight. It's not the right voice for this hat. Lurtag may or may not include a severe social separation in order to ensure that this engagement did not spoil other social relations. This town ain't big. Actually, this works quite well. The town ain't doing it the big enough. Yeah, and then you shoot. In order to ensure that this engagement did not spoil other social relations, but the example of Hans Talhaffer's advice on the matter suggests that relative freedom was maintained for the participants. In all likelihood, this would have been the time in which MS-133 was employed, an instructional tool to prepare a duelist-to-be via the purgatory of drilling compound actions with fairly common armaments. There's a lot to unpack in that phrase, and I should have probably cited somebody, because that's somebody else's idea. Shoot. This process of reading, contemplating the fight, and making preparations, such as taking the Eucharist, were all meant to break ignorance, and thus also distance, between the fighters and God. Lurtag's varied degrees of separation led to the fight's liminality, in which the moral and mortal realities within the community are embrittled. If we further extrapolate via Victor Turner's notes on rites of passage, this liminality has to be resolved with the reintegration of the participants into the larger social order, with one remaining with the living as a preordained executioner, and the other as a soul sent to face judgment without further transgressions. So again, you would take the Eucharist, you would go to confession, take all the sacraments you can before one of you takes your final sacrament of the last rites. The latter must go through a severe change of status, while the former essentially conserves instead of being transformed. The uncertainty, actually, arguably, since they became the executioner, there is sort of a subtle transformation going on, but you know what I mean. The uncertainty of who would become transfigured by guilt and death is a social drama particular to the medieval rural German settlements, a performance of the community's fears over death, divine retribution, and what to do with anger. It is only through the deity acting directly as an agent of judgment in this ordeal that any of those fears can be assuaged in this ritual performance of justice. This performance, and Walpurga's place in it, reveal that the martial ethic of at least one rural German community contained a particular pedagogy. It's another voodoo word, pedagogy meaning a system of instruction, or method in the theory of instruction, that was adapted for anyone to enact this lethal social drama. And even if you don't kill the person, they would mostly be hanged, especially in England. The textuality of MS-133 relies on the reader having an established familiarity. I don't know that word. Seeing as it does not introduce any material on fundamental footwork, for instance. The system appears to be based around 7 primary invitation guards, or custodia, which some have suggested, based on experimentation, require wide space between the combatants prior to entering into the foe's range and engaging their weapon. That's based off of a very specific presentation in 2018? Combat Con, I think? Specifically, the second ward is worth examining here, as Walpurga is seen in a variation of the martial body position. Hager argues that Walpurga has been taught to straighten her posture and bring her armaments towards her body in order to compensate for facing a presumably stronger male opponent. To provide contrast for how important this is, Talhaffer recommends that if a man and a woman should fight one another, they should dig a small pit for the man to stand in, thus giving the woman a better chance of victory in this idea. In this case, MS-133 gives no such encumbrances, favoring instead to teach the reader, by Walpurga's example, how to conserve strength without surrendering measure or losing technique. This gender equity, as part of the martial ethic, reinforces the uncommonly known fact that while rare, women were not totally withheld from the martial sphere. at least to the extent that teaching Walpurga how to fight a man or recording how Walpurga decided to fight a man was worth teaching through this preserved epistemology. This epistemology had, in short, an adaptable pedagogy that was prepared to teach women how to fence, if not to integrate the tactical variations of the system that women may have created from their own experience. However, we only got a few paragraphs left, guys. This one's tight. However, there is one section of training that we ought to examine briefly, that of mental fortitude. Oh, God. Historians cannot presume to project their modern morals into ancient persons, but it would be potentially egregious to imagine that, even within the martial ethic that we have herein described, dear God, I'm losing blood flow, a person entering Lurtog does not hold some apprehension regarding this mutually agreed death-dealing. It is arguably quite reductive, even dehumanizingly ahistorical, to suggest that ancient peoples have no regard for human lives, choosing instead to be callous and wanton. Lurtog may well have included set times for prayer to strengthen combatants' mettle, as well as bodies. Turn back to the effect book's settle here. Even, to paraphrase, even the preternatural entities do not want to lay their immortal souls on the line into bald-faced challenge of a premeditated micro-battle, but a brazen priest or a cleven woman are willing. The martial ethic employed from the Zettel to the last choir, this nature culture of Deus Vult, is one that seeks out violence for its own, is not one that seeks out violence for its own sake. It's getting loose now, but I can still feel it hurting. The ecclesiastical warning against such potentially incriminating, damning deeds demonstrates what high stakes were understood by the writers of the Fecht book. In agreeing to meet a foe for combat, the fencer concedes to the supremacy of the divine will, which ultimately could make them a better fighter. How? Well, scholasticism at the time, specifically Thomas Aquinas, held that man was above other animals by virtue of rationality, which I've mentioned before. But this cognitive potential had to be unlocked with reading, contemplating, and praying to the deity, which parallels effectively how a student must experiment and discuss fencing technique in order to practice intelligently. In the fight, there is no room for thought, so the fencer must be present, in the moment, in the Christ consciousness, as Aquinas put it, that accepts the physical limitations of the mortal body while also maintaining the control over self. The discussion, thank God, also requires some socio-historical context regarding women at arms in the medieval period before we arrive at the end of this preliminary investigation. What did other works of literature have to say regarding women stepping out of their assigned gender roles? Largely, it appears that it was perfectly sane to consider the idea of a woman taking up arms, but it was still expected that they should be recipients of violence rather than giving it, rather than agents of it. Based on romance poems, both contemporary to and preceding MS.I33 that feature this conceit, women who engaged in warfare were expected to only temporarily slide out of their dresses and into armor for the most exceptional circumstances. After the conclusion of the armed conflict, these romances suggest that a truly righteous woman should return to her previous role as a fulfillment of her feminine duty. Walpurga, as I have previously mentioned, this one I am cheating to call it headwear just because it's nice. Walpurga, as I have previously mentioned, does not abandon... Oh, fuck, I can't see. She cannot previously abandon her feminine role as a protector, even if she is a real person and not a symbolic representation of the saint. The romances essentially seek what Turner might call communitas, the reassimilation of society into its normative values after confronting a dangerously ambiguous moment in the liminality of ritual combat, or narrative conflict in this case, of the romances, I mean, with strong emphasis on patriarchal social structure. In effect, Walpurga is an embodied German Catholic vision of an ideal woman. She displaces aggression, yet has the manly courage to face it and not lose herself in the tempting heat of bellicose endeavors. However, her use of adapting a ward to better suit the sexual dimorphism she is faced with shows that technique and victory both could transcend gender. By now, not an insignificant portion of those reading or listening to this essay may begin to question what the relevance of this discourse truly is. One purpose behind writing this is a petty, implicit wish to debunk the Ridley Scott-style reductionist fantasies of the medieval world. Such myths include... Where's my pause button? Such myths include the idea that medieval imaginations were either purely allegory or pure literalism. Others construe Christendom as a cultural monolith of unchanging power and absolute papal control, where all could be traced back to Rome. Specifically here, I want to mention the guy who thought that MS-133 was written by like a Byzantine knight or someone who traveled and served in Byzantium. It's a fun theory, but it's very convoluted. It'd make for a fun movie, but like, no. Just no. Not everything is Roman. And fundamentally, it is nihilistically boring to argue that no one, especially women, could vie for moments to express autonomy in spite of cultural superstructures. Hold on. Getting to pop. This isn't really a head cover, but I'm going to need to move the mic forward. This particular point is relevant in my practice as a historical European martial arts fencer. It comes to the attention of practitioners old and new that sequestering women into their own divisions seems a tad odd. As Jake Pretty says, these divisions are fundamentally flawed and unnecessary, quote unquote, since they implicitly perpetuate the myth that women cannot cope nor train with the same risk to bodily injury as men can. Walpurga's example, I hope, has reflected the truth back to the readers of MS-133 with regards to feminine motility within the martial arts. More than anything else, though, I have worked to convince the reader of the religiosity of MS-133, not as an exception among pre-Enlightenment fect books, but as a clear epitome within the genre of this fundamentally overlooked attribute. I would argue further that the very act of fencing, let alone recording fencing technique in a treatise or interpreting earlier martial arts texts, is a fundamentally spiritual process. The nature, culture, and God are indexically present in ancient combat, but combat in the present carries indexicalities to skill, luck, class, and other secularized facets of human experience. So this analysis is necessary to better grasp the importance placed on ritual combat within MS-133's historical moment. Thank you for listening for those who did. I will put a link to the PDF of this in the description where you can find my source material. I'm Endymion for the Dork at Arms, etc. Thank you. Where's my stop button?